energy expert, Senator Sherwin Gatchalian.
Senators Cayetano, Pia, and Gatchalian Sherwin are recognized. That's going to be sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, and Majority Leader, thank you very much. At the onset, let me thank the good sponsor for allowing this representation to continue some more clarificatory questions. And I thank her for her patience and also for her indulgence. And thank you very much also for sending some documents to us to explain some of the questions this representation had during the last session, Mr. President.
But that I'm more than happy to answer His Honor's questions, but this representation thought that the questions would end with my Vice Chairman, but apparently it did not. So I hope we can, we'll do our best to answer His Honor's questions so we can move on to the period of amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, being Her Honor's Vice Chairman, I'm committed to assist her to sharpen the bill in any way I can, and also to make sure that the bill redounds to consumer benefit, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, I'll go to the topic of aggregation, Mr. President. And this is a unique feature of the bill. And going through the bill, I acknowledge that this aggregation is a unique feature that is introduced in the bill in order to promote natural gas, Mr. President. So I would like to ask the good sponsor, what is the rationale for including aggregation in the bill, Mr. President?
Well, Mr. President,
Okay.
aggregation is an important feature of this bill because in our primary objective of promoting energy security and recognizing that natural gas will play a big role in energy security, being our transition fuel, that will help us transition sooner than later to renewable energy. We want to create a situation, or we want to create an environment where we have the economies of scale, we have the power, the ability, I'll call it the economic stature to bring in natural gas at the lowest possible price. And it's basic economics. It's economics 101 that if you can purchase in bulk, then you have purchasing power. You can negotiate prices better. So the concept of aggregation would be to allow different investors, suppliers of imported LNG to pool and to, I guess, bid for the best possible prices and to be able to bring down the purchase price of LNG when it enters the country. Right now, LNG is currently part of the mix of available source of energy as indigenous gas is, but we are not able to buy it at very competitive prices. So that is really the concept in a nutshell, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I saw in the definition, and there are several definitions for aggregation and then one for aggregated gas. And let me just read the definition of aggregated gas. This is under Section 4C. Aggregated gas refers to indigenous natural gas that has been combined with or supplemented by imported LNG pursuant to the required minimum percentage of indigenous gas as provided in Section 4B of this Act. Gas that is blended or combined with purely imported LNG without any portion of the gas coming from indigenous gas sources shall not be considered aggregated gas. So in other words, Mr. President, from what I understand it, aggregated gas should contain indigenous gas. Is that correct, Mr. President?
Sorry, can you
That-
repeat the question? I was conferring with my staff.
Aggregated gas should always be combined with indigenous gas.
Yes, Mr. President, that is correct. Indigenous natural gas should always be included in the mix. Otherwise, it is not aggregated gas.
Okay, Mr. President. And then for now, Mr. President, since there's only one source of indigenous gas, the aggregator for this aggregated gas is only going to be one entity, Mr. President. For now, Mr. President.
No, we have not defined who, I mean, there is no specific mention of who the aggregator is. Under the bill, it is DOE that will take the lead in aggregation. So as it is, we don't know. DOE in some countries, it is government that is the aggregator. And in some other countries, the aggregator is a third party.
Correct, Mr. President. I understand that DOE will only lead the aggregation, Mr. President, but eventually it will be the private sector who will aggregate the gas, Mr. President. That's the way I understand it. In Section 15, the DOE shall lead and initiate the aggregation, but eventually, after leading and initiating, it will be the private sector who will aggregate the gas, Mr. President.
Can we end there?
Actually, Mr. President, what was envisioned when we drafted this is that DOE will take the lead in implementing this project. So it could be DOE or it could be a third party.
Or a third party?
Yes.
Let me just dissect the comments, Mr. President. If it's DOE, does that mean that DOE will raise capital in order to aggregate?
No, the objective here is for DOE to lead to take the initial step in promoting aggregation. So it would convene the various sectors in the natural gas industry, and it may get ideas from the industry on how to proceed. It doesn't necessarily mean one thing or the other thing, Mr. President.
So, but DOE will not be the counterparty to the contracts. Will they be the counterparty to the contracts? Because from what I understand, if DOE will lead, DOE will now be, for example, I'm just envisioning this, Mr. President, on how to operationalize it. It will now talk to different suppliers. First, it will talk to an indigenous gas supplier. And then after that, it will talk to other suppliers to aggregate it. But the other suppliers will always look for counterparties, Mr. President, because they will have to have a contract, Mr. President. So in that particular case where DOE will be the aggregator, will DOE be the counterparty? Because if it's the counterparty, then it will also have some form of capital, Mr. President.
I think his honor answered the question by the way he phrased his question. If DOE is the aggregator, then it is the counterparty.
He's
But
the
it's not
counterparty.
the aggregator because it could be the lead convener. It could be what we want is DOE takes the lead. DOE can also decide, you know what, after talking to all of you, none of you should be the aggregator. I will do it myself. DOE can also do that. That is how this
Okay.
humble representation has viewed this provision to be implemented. We're
Okay.
happy to get any comments, suggestions from His Honor, but that really was the intention.
That's the intention for DOE will to be the counterparty for all of this.
No, Mr. President. The intention is to DOE to take the lead in taking this step towards aggregation. So
Okay,
which
all
means
right.
siya yung magpapatawag ng, oh guys, we're gonna do aggregation, let's sit down together, let's sit down in the drawing board, let's talk about this. If it turns out that there's a lot of resistance to and let's just say there are two contenders. So we want to be one of the top importers of LNG. Says I'm volunteering to be the lead aggregator, and then the one and only indigenous gas supplier also says me too. I'm volunteering. So as the lead in this project, DOE will help determine which is the best solution for the country, and if it comes to choosing between one, then as the lead agency, then DOE will have to make that call. If DOE is not happy with any of them, then I suppose DOE can say, like other countries, we'll do it ourselves.
Okay. Okay.
So it's very general.
So DOE has the potential to do it themselves. For example, if the market for example, if DOE figures that they can command a better price through economies of scale, DOE can conduct the aggregation itself. In other words,
Yes,
Mr.
but
President.
I believe that will be determined once we pass this law, and then DOE now says, let's proceed with the discussions on aggregation. Then DOE can come to that conclusion.
All right, Mr. President. And then, Mr. President, the other modality is through a third party. If DOE thinks that a third party is more efficient in that case, considering that a third party will be much more attuned to the situation, the market situation, the third party can do it.
Definitely, Mr. President, definitely.
And then the third, Mr. President, in this case, since there's only one supplier of indigenous gas, there will only be one third party, Mr. President, because there's only one supplier.
You mean there will only be one, because you need natural gas, indigenous
Correct,
gas.
indigenous
and-
gas in the mix.
For now, there will only be one. For now, but this whole bill is precisely about opening up the industry to having more indigenous gas suppliers. So
All right.
that is only a temporary solution, the temporary situation, Mr. President.
Correct. But since now we only have one supplier, the third party can only be one supplier, Mr. President, at least in the medium term, short to medium term, Mr. President.
Short
And-
term, because right now the only supplier contributing to our energy security by way of indigenous gas is that one supplier. So for now, it is really that one supplier.
Correct, Mr. President. And Mr. President, I will also connect this to Section 21, where we talked about the prioritization. Since there's only one supplier, Mr. President, and there will be prioritization, Mr. President. And from what I understand, the prioritization removes the price discovery process, Mr. President. So in other words, that one supplier can now dictate whatever price this entity will sell because of the prioritization, Mr. President. Based on my reading of the bill, Mr. President, because there's only one supplier, at least in the short term, and there's prioritization to that indigenous gas. So even imported LNG, since it's part of the aggregation, will now lose price discovery, Mr. President.
Mr. President, last week when His Honor was asking me about price discovery, we responded that there will still be price discovery. That is not being changed under this bill.
Okay, so Mr. President, even though there's prioritization in the bill, bidding or price discovery will still be a key activity in the supply of gas to power plants.
Yes, Mr. President, because in fact, this representation so far on the data that we've seen, it seems very clear that the prices of indigenous natural gas are very, very competitive, especially when you include the cost of regasification. So even in the example that His Honor gave about the current prices of LNG compared to indigenous natural gas, they weren't that far apart. And if you include the cost of regasification, then by far, indigenous natural gas was lower. So there is really nothing to hide, Mr. President. There's full intention to disclose prices to all parties.
Thank you, Mr. President. And typically, price discovery, a key feature of price discovery or bidding will be the lowest price, Mr. President, or least cost in the parlance of the electric power industry. And that will still remain, Mr. President, in the price discovery process, Mr. President. Because least cost, if you go through IPIRA, if you go through the regulations of ERC, least cost is the feature, or least cost is the criteria that they use in order to decide what is the best for our consumers. And that will remain, that key feature will remain in price discovery, Mr. President.
Okay. There's no change on that, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the answer, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, another on the same topic of aggregation, Mr. President, I just want to be clarified. Since DOE will be the lead, let me just. DOE will lead and initiate aggregation. What conditions will it trigger DOE to initiate and lead the aggregation, Mr. President? What type of conditions does DOE see in order for it to aggregate, Mr. President?
Actually, Mr. President, aggregation is a key component of this measure. So as soon as we pass this measure, it is DOE's obligation to start discussing aggregation with the key players.
Okay, Mr. President, I will connect this to economies of scale and getting the best purchase price. Getting the best purchase price. Will it wait for those type of conditions before it convenes, Mr. President? For example, I'll give a very specific example. And we pointed this out last time. I understand that the current market price of Malampaya gas now is at 12, if I'm not mistaken, per MMBTU, Mr. President. 12. And landed cost and regasification of imported gas, whether it's from Henry Hub or JKM, is about 14? More or less, mga 14, Mr. President. No? So the spread is not so big, Mr. President. The spread is not as substantial. Will it wait for a bigger spread before it aggregates, Mr. President? It to be triggered to aggregate because the spread is substantial. As to if the spread is small, and it will still do aggregation, the realization of savings will not be as substantial, Mr. President. So my point there is what conditions that it has to experience before it
We're not
goes.
putting any conditions, Mr. President.
So there's no conditions, Mr. President. So at any given time, they can just aggregate, Mr. President.
Yes, because the sheer act of aggregating all the different possible supplies of LNG will already give us a better purchasing power, Mr. President. So that alone is a good enough reason to initiate the aggregation.
Okay. Mr. President, since I heard earlier, since there will be price discovery, that's one safety that we can assure the public that even in the aggregation, it will still compete with other LNG, Mr. President, with other natural gas suppliers, Mr. President.
Sorry, what was the...
My point, since Her Honor mentioned about there will be price discovery, so we can have a scenario wherein we have aggregated gas competing with LNG, Mr. President. because there will be price discovery from the point of off-takers, from the point of buying gas. So aggregated gas can compete with other LNG, Mr. President, with other suppliers.
I think, Mr. President, I'll use a analogy in business. I've been an entrepreneur for more than half of my life. I can import products on my own, but if there's a local, and normally it's cheaper when I do that, but the volumes that will be asked of me is going to be higher. Or I can deal with a local importer here, and if they're such a big importer, then their prices are good, I'll just buy from them. Usually, if I'm willing to buy more, then I'll be able to buy it more on my own directly by importing. But that's precisely the underlying factor there is you're buying more. So this is an open invitation to all parties to join the aggregation so that they can get the lowest possible price. Pero kung gusto nilang magsarili, gusto nilang mag-import mag-isa, wala namang pipigil sa kanila. But it's basic economics. They may not get the best price, and that's their choice.
Correct, Mr. President. But they can, aggregated gas can compete with imported LNG, Mr. President.
Definitely. But again, I emphasize that
Of course, we want.
every entity is allowed, will be invited to join the aggregation.
Yes, correct, Mr. President. Well, at the end of the day, let's allow the off-taker to decide. And if there will be bidding, there will be price discovery, then I'm sure that the lowest bid, since this is a commodity, the lowest bidder will probably end up getting the contract. But it's very important that even though there's an aggregation feature in the bill, it doesn't mean that this aggregated gas will have priority or will have exclusive supply to off-takers, Mr. President. There will still be price discovery before the contract will be consumed by the off-takers, and a scenario wherein aggregated gas can be competing with imported gas can also happen, Mr. President.
Yes, I believe it can happen.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President, for the clarification. Ba tayo sa obligation? Or done with that now? Hindi, pero yung sa ano, sa aggregation, wala na. Wala na. Thank you, Mr. President. I'll jump to my next topic, Mr. President, which is tax incentives. Mr. President, I would like to be enlightened. Is the gas being sold by Malampaya? What is the VAT status of the gas being sold by Malampaya?
It is VAT exempt, Mr. President.
Okay, it's already VAT exempt because I saw in section 36 2, letter A.
Just to be clear, right now it is VAT exempt up to the sale to the power plant.
Up to the sale to the power plant. In section 36 2A, section 36 gives the entitlement of VAT exemption to several activities related to natural gas. In letter A, it's written here that purchase and sale of indigenous gas, Mr. President. So, in other words, sale of indigenous gas is already covered right now by VAT exemption, Mr. President.
Yes. I think the objective really here was to just cover it from beginning to end because in the current bill now, the VAT exemption shall extend all the way to the end user. So this is really a complete enumeration. But as His Honor correctly observed, there's no difference in that letter A. That is already currently happening.
That's already existing, Mr. President. So the intention just to cover everything, Mr. President. Mr. President, I understand that the sale of gas up to the power plant is already VAT exempt or VAT exempted. But the whole Section 36(2) exempts the entire chain, no, from purchase and sale of indigenous gas in letter A, purchase and sale of electricity or ancillary services produced by generation facilities, that's in letter B. And it goes on, Mr. President. So in other words, the VAT exemption will now be expanded all the way to consumer level, Mr. President?
Yes, that is correct.
And how much are we going to lose in terms of VAT payments in this, Mr. President?
I don't have the exact numbers, but I do have the go signal from DOF. The secretary himself has confirmed, because since both His Honor and I, well, I have been the past chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means, and His Honor is the current chairman. So the first thing I asked was, does DOF support this? And I spoke directly to the secretary, and he said the benefit to us is immeasurable and incomparable to the loss of revenues for the VAT exemption that will occur because of the VAT exemption.
All right, Mr. President. And Mr. President, at a later time, if we can be also furnished with computation on how much will be foregone in terms of VAT payments, Mr. President. So later on, we're just requesting for a computation on that, Mr. President.
Noted.
Thank you, Mr. President. And then, Mr. President, this is a technical question which we want to be enlightened. I understand here that the VAT exemption will only be extended to indigenous gas, Mr. President. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So, Mr. President, for example, normally power plants will have a combination of indigenous gas and also imported LNG. Only that portion being supplied by indigenous gas will be VAT exempted from sale all the way to consumer level, Mr.
That is
President.
correct.
And technically, how can that be determined, Mr. President? Because from the way I understand it from technical people, once you inject gas, it's very difficult to determine which one is from indigenous sources, which one is from LNG. More so when you inject that in the power plants, and more so when you transmit that all the way to household level, Mr. President. Because along the way, there will be losses, no? For example, there will be system losses along the way. There will be line rentals along the way. So how do you determine, Mr. President, from the point indigenous gas is injected in the power plants to the point all the way to the consumer level, all the way to the household level. Which portion of that will be VAT exempt, Mr. President?
For your entire. You will miss the gym. Yes. So the gym for most, 10% of the gas is, yeah, okay. So 10% yung ipapasok niya.
Okay. So I'll start with the example. With aggregated gas. In that case, the DOE would be fixing what that mix is. And so when this is then purchased by the power plants, that percentage of that mix will be followed. So his Honor is correct that we can't identify which gas literally came from indigenous sources and which gas came from imported sources, but we do know what the percentage of that mix is. So if that mix is 20% versus 80%, then you can accurately you know for a fact that 20% of that gas would then be subjected to the VAT exemption, even if you cannot pinpoint which one, but you know that percentage. So it's the same, it works the same way with power plants when they purchase from their different sources. They also know what is the percentage of the mix that they eventually have. So if 10% of their total is indigenous gas, then 10% will be passed on as VAT-free exemptions, Mr. President.
Three. So, Mr. President, it's technically possible to determine the the amount of indigenous gas being supplied and converted into electricity, power and electricity all the way to the household, so that the BIR, no, will have a mechanism or a way to validate the indigenous gas that will be exempted. My point, Mr. President, and I am sure Her Honor knows this very well, being the former chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, some of the concepts that we want to introduce might be rational, but in terms of administration and audit, it will be quite difficult because, first of all, technically, it's very going to be complicated, and second, the audit will be quite complicated as well. And that is what we experienced when we introduced excise tax on fuel, Mr. President, because fuel is one of the most literally very fluid, one of the most one commodity that is easily smuggled. The leakage is quite substantial, and introducing excise tax on fuel might be logical, but tracking it down and making sure that the amount being paid is accurately declared is something else, Mr. President. And that's why I think Her Honor is the one who introduced the fuel marking in the supply of fuel. It's additional cost for government, additional cost for consumers, but it definitely reduces the leakage in terms of smuggling and in terms of misdeclaration and underdeclaration. So the point here being, Mr. President, is the administration of the VAT exemption. Can the BIR track down and audit the amount of exemption that these companies will claim? No? Because obviously they will claim VAT exemption. And is there a way for the BIR to determine the amount that should be VAT exempted, Mr. President?
Actually, Mr. President, with His Honor's, the concerns raised by His Honor, we would be very open, and we can also directly take the lead in crafting language to ensure that DOF with BIR will come up with the proper language to implement this provision as envisioned. Just like we have mentioned on the technical side that DOE will come up with the rules and regulations, we can do the same for DOF, because the fact that DOF is on board with this, and we take note that it is a loss of revenue for them, then we will ask them to give us, if they have more, if they have more language to provide beyond what this representation is willing to do, which would basically be a provision that DOF and or BIR with the under the supervision of DOF will come up with the proper rules and regulations for the proper implementation. I think that's the best that we can do, because as His Honor said, it is technical, but it is a loss of revenue for them, so it's on them to to make sure that they can implement it properly. So we can put in that basic language.
Thank you, Mr. President. And at the proper time, Mr. President will also, with the permission of the good sponsor, will also introduce some language to that effect, Mr. President. And then, Mr. President, and I know this is also on incentives, and I know Her Honor knows this very well. And this is on the topic of SIPP, Mr. President. And I'm very, very sure that Her Honor knows the criteria and the mechanisms for SIPP, Mr. President. And I notice here that there's an automatic inclusion of PGNI facilities as Tier 3, Mr. President. And we introduced the different tiers in CREATE, as Her Honor knows, being the sponsor and the author of that law. And this is to come up with different criteria and different value creation for the country, Mr. President. And in Tier 3, in the NIRC, the activities that are included here includes research and development. What is this? What is this? Research and development resulting in demonstrable. Mabasa. Where is it? Ito na lang. Tier 3 activities shall include research.
A minute suspension, please.
Session suspended for a minute.
Mr. President, Mr. President, in response to His Honor's question, the objective really is to provide a mechanism where DOE can mandate NGCP to procure a minimum percentage of ancillary services. That is really the intention. But upon conferring with the our colleague, he said he may submit a wording at the proper time about bidding. We're open to see what that is. But my response is consistent with the objective of the bill, which is energy security. And for you to make a stand on energy security, then you have to make a stand on prioritization. And that is why, consistent with the objective of the bill, there is that provision that there is the example we're giving is saying that yes, it could possibly mandate that there will be a mix of in that mix. It will include indigenous gas because that is the only way that we can ensure that we have our own source of gas, that there's that environment where there will be the purchase of the indigenous gas. And I will always repeat when I say that, and historically, and we've shown the chart, indigenous gas has always been consistently, it has always had a more consistent, stable pricing compared to the pricing of imported gas. That is data that we did not make up. It is data that is historically there, Mr. President. But like we said, we are open to His Honor's submission of amendments at the proper time.
Thank you, Mr. President, for allowing this representation to submit some amendments to make sure that at the ancillary service level, there's also bidding or price discovery. Right now, Mr. President, the mechanism, and this is actually a very current issue. NGCP had to raise rates because of the new contracted ancillary services as mandated by the DOE. It's now on a firm basis, and because it's on a firm basis, they had to increase electricity rates. Right now, it's technology. And Mr. President, my concern is if we don't have any price discovery at the ancillary services contracting, NGCP will just be mandated to contract from one source, which is power plants being supplied by indigenous gas sources. Because of the firm basis right now, it's technology agnostic, meaning it's more expensive from hydropower plants than the normal geothermal, as long as electricity rates being supplied by power plants. And if we remove that in other words, feature, it will become then NGCP will now more expensive. Will now be mandated to contract from indigenous sources. And typically, because of the firm basis of ancillary services, I think the good it's more expensive for allowing this representation to the normal, so that we make sure that electricity rates being supplied by power plants. So, in other words, it will become price discovery, and we can assure our consumers more expensive, that the lowest possible to contract price ancillary services given to them. So that's the point we're trying to make, Mr. President.
Under Section 21,
I thank the good sponsor for allowing this representation to
DOE
introduce some
establishes
amendments so
mechanisms for the
that we
optimal
make
and
sure
full
that
utilization
even
of
in the
indigenous
contracting
natural
of
gas,
ancillary
it takes
services, there's price discovery, and we can assure our consumers that the lowest possible price will be given to them.
Yes, and we just want to reiterate that under Section 21, when DOE establishes mechanisms for the optimal and full utilization of indigenous natural gas, it takes into consideration the state's policy on energy security, which I keep repeating, but also consumer welfare. So in the unlikely event that indigenous gas is significantly more expensive, and I emphasize unlikely event because the cost of regasification when you include it, will really makes indigenous gas very competitive, then DOE can always go back to this and take a look at consumer welfare. But like I also said, there's no price tag that we can put on energy security. Mamamatay tayo, Mr. President, without energy. And with our population still growing, with our desire to be competitive, our demand for energy will be very high, as His Honor knows.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, for the record, I support indigenous sources, hydropower plants, geothermal, renewable energy, whether it's intermittent or the legacy technologies, indigenous oil and gas for sure, Mr. President, because that's definitely, it's at our backyard, literally. And if we can harness those resources, Mr. President, and power our economy, then that will be the best case, Mr. President. But, Mr. President, I mentioned this during the last interpellation with Senator Cayetano, with Senator Alan Cayetano, that one thing I learned and one thing that I've seen in the energy sector, that the concept of energy security has also changed because of geopolitical events, Mr. President. So now energy security, the concept of energy security should espouse flexibility, should espouse diversification, as well as responsiveness, Mr. President. And a case in point of that is the invasion of Ukraine, Mr. President. That's why a lot of the European countries in a short time span built LNG terminals so that they have options, whether they want pipe gas or they want LNG through the sea, they have that option. And that's also one of the things that I think inadvertently, to be honest, happened in the Philippines because we didn't explore oil and gas in the past. That because of that impending depletion of Malampaya, gas-fired power plants had no choice but to build terminals, Mr. President. And those terminals actually became an additional. Those terminals became, in my opinion, became another source for us to import LNG from different countries. And because of that diversification, in effect, we have now options that we can tap into, whether it's indigenous gas or imported, but now we have options that open opportunities for the energy sector, Mr. President. So in other words, it's also evolving because of geopolitical consideration and also because of the situation, Mr. President.
I agree. I agree that we look at what's happening in the world, and sometimes inadvertently it happens. So in as much as we have been we chanced upon this global impactful war that affected the prices of natural gas. The more reason, though, Mr. President, that we should be promoting indigenous natural gas. More reason. And the terminals will support both imported natural gas and indigenous natural gas. So in terms of building the facilities, that's covered by our bill. But in terms of promoting one versus the other, I will always repeat that we do not foresee a situation where we can live with only one type of energy source. So we will have to promote both indigenous natural gas, mostly for energy security, and then we will still have to rely on importation as well. So the building of the facilities will be needed regardless of the sources.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, Mr. President, I conclude my interpellation, Mr. President. But before I conclude, may I be allowed to spread into the records some of my concerns and observations in the bill, and at the proper time, Mr. President, will submit some amendments to address
Spent
these
as
concerns,
Chairman,
Mr.
Chairman,
As
so
His
we're
Honor
more than
recalls,
happy
the
to
proper
have
time
His
we
Honor
agreed
share
upon was
his
the past 2 weekends.
research
So we are
and
very
his
happy to
observations.
receive it
Thank you.
Thank you,
anytime
thank you,
His Honor
thank you to the good sponsor. Thank you, Mr. President. And Mr. President, dear colleagues, I rise
Yeah, go
today
ahead.
before
I'll
this
sit down
August
while His
chamber
Honor,
to
spreads
deliver
into
my
the record his,
manifestation of serious concerns on the
respect his,
proposed measure,
experience and,
Senate Bill number 2793 under Committee
time that he
Report
has spent as
304,
energy,
otherwise known as the
chairman,
Philippine
so
Natural
we're
Gas
more than
Industry
happy to
Development
have
Act.
His Honor share
Mr.
his,
President, we recognize the good
research and
sponsor's
his
intent to
observations.
achieve
Thank you.
energy security
Thank you to the good
and to
sponsor.
encourage
Thank you, Mr.
investment in the upstream oil and gas sector. I would like to put on record that the midstream and downstream natural gas industry is a nascent sector. Thus, it is our responsibility to ensure there will be a level playing field for current and future investors, and that the market power of first entrants is tempered. However, this representation has strong concerns about specific provisions in the bill, given its negative impact on competition and ultimately consumers who will ultimately bear the burden of more expensive fuel and electricity. For instance, we need to ensure that the Energy Regulatory Commission can still protect consumers through the least cost standard when reviewing power supply agreements. But under Section 6 of this bill, this standard shifts to full recovery of reasonable costs. This means that instead of ensuring the lowest possible price, we will now have to cover all costs incurred by power generation from gas power plants.
Can still protect consumers.
When it comes to aggregation in Section 15, there are also three major competition concerns that we should be wary of. First, the reality is that there will only be one aggregator right now, and in the near future, since we only have one source of indigenous gas. The aggregator will act as the master planner for natural gas.
When it comes
This
to
means
aggregation,
we
in
are
Section
leaving our
15,
entire supply
there are also
of
three
natural
major
gas and our
competition
energy
concerns
security
that
in the
we
hands
should
of
be wary
just
of.
one entity,
First,
which
the
is
reality
risky
is
considering that
there will only be
diversification
one
of energy
aggregator
sources
right now,
and supply
and in the near future,
supply
since we
supply
only
routes
have
is
one
critical
source
in
of
energy
indigenous
security.
gas.
Second, the
aggregator
role
will
of
act
the
as
government
the
in this
master
process is
planner
unclear.
for natural gas.
Will it
This means
merely be
we are
a
leaving our
bystander,
entire supply of
informed
natural
only
gas
when
and our
aggregation
energy
happens,
security
or will
in the
it
hands
have the
of just
authority
one
to
entity,
allow or disallow
which is
it?
risky
We
considering
note that if we allow government to
diversification of
undertake
energy sources
aggregation
and supply,
together with the private sector, this goes
supply
against the
routes is
principle of
critical in
competitive
energy security.
neutrality
Second, the role of
and
the
will result
government
in a
this
conflict
process
of
is
interest
unclear.
where the
Will
regulated
it
entity is
merely
also
be
the
a bystander?
regulator. Third, the
Informed only
aggregation
when
and then
aggregation happens,
prioritization
or
of
will it
indigenous
have the
gas without
authority to
sufficient
allow or
monitoring
disallow it?
and
We note that
verification mechanisms.
If we allow government to undertake
We are making
aggregation
space
together
for
with the
industry
private
players
sector,
to game the
this goes
system.
against the principle
To avail the
of competitive
prioritization, the seller of
neutrality,
aggregated gas
and
can
will
always
result in
declare
a
a higher
conflict of
percentage
interest
of indigenous
where
gas,
the regulated
even though
entity
a
is
lower
also
share
the
is
regulator.
utilized.
Third,
Mr.
the
President, these
aggregation
concerns
and then
highlight
prioritization
the
of
urgent need
indigenous gas
for
without
transparent
sufficient
regulations
monitoring
and check to protect
verification mechanisms.
consumers and ensure a
We
competitive
are making
market.
space for
Moreover,
industry
there are
players
three
to game
types of
the system.
prioritization
To
outlined
avail
in the
the
provisions
prioritization, the seller
of the natural
aggregated
gas
can
supplier
always
under Section
declare a higher
21.
percentage of
First,
indigenous gas,
prioritization of
even
indigenous
though
gas
a
over
lower share
imported
is
gas.
utilized.
Second, prioritization of
President,
power
these
produced from
concerns highlight
indigenous gas
the
over
urgent need
other
for
energy
transparent
sources in
regulations
power supply
and check to
contracts.
protect
And lastly, optimal
consumers
and full
and ensure a
utilization of
competitive
indigenous
market.
gas in generation,
Moreover,
transmission
there are
and
three
supply
types of
of electric
prioritization
power,
outlined in the
including
provisions
determining the
of
minimum
the natural
percentage
gas
of
supplier
power
under
generation
Section
mix
21.
supplied by gas
First,
power
prioritization of indigenous
plants
gas over the imported
that
gas.
use indigenous
Second,
gas and
prioritization of power
requiring
produced from
electricity
indigenous gas
suppliers
over
to
other
source a
energy
portion
sources
of
in power
energy
supply
supply
contracts.
from power
And
plants
lastly,
that use
optimal and
indigenous
full
gas.
utilization of indigenous gas in generation.
I would like to put on
transmission
record
and supply
that
of
these
electric
two
power,
prioritization measures
including
cover
determining
the electric
the
power
minimum
industry,
percentage of power
which is
generation
outside
mix
the scope of
supplied
this
by
bill.
gas power
This bill
plants that
This bill's
use indigenous
provision
gas and
essentially
requiring
force a
electricity
take or pay
suppliers
mechanism
to
on
source a
both the
portion
gas
of
used by
energy
power
supply
plants and
from
on
power plants
consumers
that use
for the
indigenous
The bill states that the permit of these
This is a
pipelines
serious issue for
does not
consumers.
confer
There is
a
no
public
price
utility
determination
status
mechanism
to
to
permit
guarantee
holder.
the lowest cost.
However,
locking us
under
into
Republic Act
long-term
number
contracts with power
11659
plants
or
using
the
indigenous
Public
gas.
Services Act as amended, petroleum and petroleum products pipeline
Further,
transmission
the
systems
provisions
are
regarding
clearly
the transmission
defined
pipelines
as
under
public
Section
utilities
25.
and should be
The bill
subject to rate
states that the
regulation.
permit of
Yet
these
this bill
pipelines
does not include
does not
any rate
confer
regulation for the
a public
pipelines,
utility
which
status
means that there
to
is no
permit
safeguard
pooling.
against unfair
However,
pricing
under
for
Republic
end
Act Number
users.
11659 or
Meanwhile, the
Public
provisions
Services Act as amended
on cross
petroleum
ownership under Section
and
26
petroleum
allows
products
vertical
pipeline
integration
transmission
from
systems
upstream,
are clearly
midstream, and downstream
defined
gas
as public
industry,
utilities
including
and
sectors
should
in
be
the
subject
electric
to
power
rate
industry,
regulation.
such as
Yet this bill
generation.
does not include
The
any rate
provision
regulation
fails
for the pipelines
to provide
which
clear
means that there
unbundling
is no
rules of
safeguard
business
against
entities
unfair
for
pricing
each
for
segment
end
of the natural
users.
gas industry.
Meanwhile, the
When combined
provisions
with the other provisions of this
on
bill,
cross-ownership
such as
under Section
aggregation,
26 allows
non-classification
vertical
of
integration
transmission pipelines
from
as
upstream,
public
midstream,
utilities,
and
and
downstream gas
prioritization of
industry,
indigenous
including
gas over
sectors in
other
the
imported
electric power
gas, among
industry,
others.
such
It
as
creates a
generation.
scenario where our
The
entire
provision
gas supply
fails
could be controlled
to
by a
provide clear
few
unbundling rules of
powerful
business entities
players.
for each segment of
Finally, the
natural
provision
gas
on fiscal
industry.
incentives
When
under
combined
Section 36
with the other provisions of this
undermines
bill,
the intent of
such as
Republic Act Number
aggregation,
11534 or the
non-classification of
CREATE
transmission
Act,
pipelines
which mandates
as public
a
utilities
thorough
and
evaluation process
prioritization of
before
indigenous
any
gas over
sector
other imported
can be
gas, among
included
others.
in the
It creates a scenario where
strategic
our entire
investment
gas
priorities
supply
plan.
could be
It
controlled
allows
by
the
a few
automatic
powerful
eternal
players.
inclusion of natural gas
Finally,
downstream
the
industry
provision on
value
fiscal
chain
incentives
projects
under
in the
Section
SIPP
36
to avail of
undermines
incentives,
the intent
which
of
is
Republic
what
Act Number
CREATE sought to prevent.
11534 or
In
the
addition,
CREATE Act,
natural
which
gas
mandates
downstream
a
value
thorough
chain
evaluation process
projects
before
are not
any
defined in the
sector
bill.
can be included in the strategic investment
Mr. President, in
priorities
closing,
plan.
we must
It
remember
allows
that the
the
heart of
automatic
this bill lies not just in
eternal
policies and
inclusion
provisions,
of natural
but
gas
in the lives of
downstream
everyday
industry value
Filipinos
chain projects
who depend
in the
on
SIPP
fair
to avail of
pricing and
incentives,
reliable
which
energy.
is what
Hence,
CREATE
we
sought
have to
prevent.
ensure that
In
this bill
addition,
does not
natural gas
inadvertently
downstream
create
value
a
chain
monopolistic
projects are not
conditions
defined in the bill.
or burden our people with unnecessary cost. Thank you, Mr. President.
in
Thank you to the
closing,
good
we
sponsor.
must remember
Maraming
that the heart of this bill lies not just in policies
Yan, the
and provisions,
manifestation
but in the
of,
lives of everyday
gentleman
Filipinos
from Bulacan
who
is,
depend on
duly
fair
noted and
pricing and
inserted into the
reliable
records.
energy. Hence, we have to ensure that this
Venezuela,
bill
I'm
does not
sorry.
inadvertently
Thank you, Mr.
create
President.
a
Yes, Senator
Because
Pia.
it was quite lengthy manifestation. I was attempting to take notes to respond quickly to some, but
monopolistic
it was very
conditions
lengthy.
or burden our people with unnecessary cost. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to the good sponsor. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Senator Gatchalian. The manifestation of the gentleman from Bulacan is duly noted and inserted into the records. Valenzuela, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, Senator
Because
Pia.
it was quite lengthy manifestation. I was attempting to take notes to respond quickly to some, but it was very lengthy. So this representation would like to respond because some of them are, obviously I respect His Honor's observations and views, but as a chairperson of this committee and the sponsor of this bill, I would like to be able to respond to it so that it also goes into the record
Yes.
directly as part of His Honor's, a response to His Honor's concerns.
Please
But I'll do it
proceed.
tomorrow. Tomorrow, Mr.
Tomorrow.
President, because it's very lengthy.
All right.
And I won't be able to, by memory, and even with my handwritten notes, I cannot keep up with His Honor's many observations.
All right. Thank you, Senator Pia. Session suspended for a minute.